this way.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Leni Liebenberg, and this is the Tuesday session of the Postgraduate Academy, our postgraduate support group meeting. I'm very, very happy to be here today, and I'm very glad to see you here as well, both newcomers and regulars. So thank you very much for joining us today. For any newcomers within this group, just a reminder, these are very informal sessions, and we present a very holistic approach to enhancing our professional development in these sessions. We encourage interaction and engagement, so please feel free to use your reaction icons to express any sort of emotion. Use your raise your hand if you'd like to speak. Use the chat box for any questions or comments. We love interaction within the session. And this is a very special session today. Right now, let me just make sure that everybody is able to work with these reaction icons. Let's have a little bit of a game here. I like games. Where is my reaction? Oh, there it is. Okay, so give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if you've ever felt like you are not as intelligent or as accomplished as other, or even competent as other people believe you to be, even though you are highly educated or you have the relevant experiences. And I see lots of little thumbs up going on there. I've got loads of examples here. Give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you ever felt that you don't actually deserve your successes or your accomplishments, that there's somebody else out there, someone who's done it better, who can do it better than what you ever could. Where's my one? I need to do that one. And there's a term for this. But anyway, I just wanted to make the point that you are not alone. And this happens to almost everybody. And I guarantee you, your professors, your supervisors, your colleagues, your friends are experiencing it now, or have experienced it, or will experience it sometime. And it's so common. It has a name. The imposter syndrome, or sometimes referred to as the imposter phenomenon, or other titles, and we'll hear more about those today. And today we have a very special guest who's quite capable of addressing this particular topic. We love psychology and social scientists. Dr. Hilton Humphreys has graduated with his PhD from UKZN, definitely within the last 5 years, I think, Hilton. Yeah. He's currently based at the HSRC, that's the Human Sciences Research Council, and he's kindly agreed to share his time with us today, introduce himself, share his journey and some of his knowledge about this topic. So welcome, Hilton Humphreys. Thank you so much for taking the time to join with us today. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Lenine. So it's a privilege to be here today and also to have a chat with you. Imposter syndrome, it's a useful topic because it's something I grapple with all the time, and I grapple with it. I sort of feel like you learn to live with it rather than ever sort of dealing with it completely. And so today's presentation is just going to be a little bit about what imposter syndrome is by its, sort of boring academic definition. And then we're going to talk about types of imposter syndromes, and we're going to talk about ways of dealing with it, and then my own personal reflections on my experiences with imposter syndrome. So by way of background, as Lenine said, my name is Hilton Humphreys. I am a psychologist by training. So I have a master's in research psychology and then a PhD in public health. And my focus is on understanding human behavior and fundamentally why humans do the things they do. And so my research and my interests are focused on the mechanisms of actions and sort of behavioral change techniques that make us do the things that we do, especially in the field of sexual and reproductive health. So I hope you'll enjoy the presentation today. I have chosen the most beautiful template that Microsoft PowerPoint could ever possess. And so I'm overusing it chronically in all my presentations at the moment. And it's also meant to be we always say interactive, and Zoom is the worst for interactive because you can all hide behind the little black boxes that are on the screen. But please raise your hand or just, say something and we can talk, because I may not see your hand on the side. So if you want to stop me, feel free to stop me. And it'll also be useful to hear your own reflections on your feelings of imposter syndrome, and on your own feelings about, if there's something else that it sort of triggers or that it brings up. It would be interesting to have those reflections. So let's get cracking. And so I purposely, which is a rare thing for me, have made very few slides. In fact, it's a struggle. I love to put lots of things on slides, and now let's see if we can get the slide moving. So please, let's use the time. All right. So now it wasn't clicking and now it's clicking. I'm just trying to minimize this little thing so I can see. Sorry, I just want to see the slides here. Okay, so can any of you relate with the following? And I mean, maybe if we can use your reaction buttons, that will be useful as well. This is sort of what Lenine had been mentioning before, but first of all, do you ever feel like you attribute your success to luck or timing rather than your own skills and your talents? Do you ever worry that others will find out that you're not as competent or capable as you think you are? Do you feel like you've unknowingly deceived people into thinking you're good enough for the job? Do you feel undeserving of your success? And at any moment, do you feel like you may be exposed as fraud? So just thumbs up if you've ever felt any of those things. Okay. So this is classic imposter syndrome, or like Lenine mentioned, imposter phenomenon. And it's all those feelings that you feel, even often that you don't express them or you won't verbalize them. You think them in your mind, often unconsciously or consciously. But what it is fundamentally, and when we think about it from a psychological perspective, it's just a pattern of individual doubt, where an individual doubts their accomplishment and has this persistent internalized fear of being exposed as a fraud. So you're constantly feeling like someone's going to find out that I'm not as good as they think that I am, or that they're going to realize that I've just been making this up, that I haven't been doing this properly, that it's not my skill, it's not my talent, it's just all pure luck. It's often where imposter syndrome is also this internal experience of believing that your accomplishments were manifested out of luck and rather than skill. So like I mentioned, not feeling like you deserve it, not feeling like it is because of your accomplishments or your intelligence or your skills or your ability, but rather because it's just dumb luck, right? So it can also be related not only to luck, but feelings of a lack of competence in your certain role. So you may feel that you don't deserve it, that someone else is more competent and that you got it, somehow you got into this position, but you're not actually worthy of it. And you don't perceive yourself as being actually worthy of that role. The interesting thing is that imposter syndrome fundamentally is like most common amongst high achieving people. And so it's high amongst business professionals, research, academia and academics, all those sorts of people, high-flying business people. There's many very successful people who have felt like they are imposters in their positions. It commonly occurs at transition points. So it's not, when we're talking about transition points, it's not just like, oh, I'm moving a job, I'm moving from one position to another. These transition points can be like moving from doing a master's to a PhD, right? So you're like, I'm not worthy of doing a PhD, I don't deserve to do a PhD. If you're going from a PhD to becoming a more independent researcher, for instance, you may have feelings of like, I didn't, I'm going to get caught out. This PhD was, not as good as everyone thinks about it. I didn't deserve these things. So it can be those transition points, not only in terms of career or job transitions, but it can be, sort of just transitions from doing degrees. It can be transitions from going from one job to another. You get a promotion, you feel like the promotion isn't deserved. It's just luck, or someone else will deserve it better, and you'll be exposed as fraud at any point. So that's when you're at most at risk of feelings of imposter syndrome. There are studies that say, it affects both genders. There are studies that show that 70% of the population in general will experience imposter syndrome at some point. There's been studies that a lot of this work has been done in the US. And so what they've shown is that, especially amongst graduate students, especially those that are the first in their families to enter into university, often feel feelings like they don't belong there, and that it's not deserved. It's also highly prevalent amongst women and people of color, where they feel it's not, they're not there, they don't belong there, they've somehow just managed to get in there. Someone's going to find out that they shouldn't be there. It does disproportionately affect women, but men also impact it, and I am living proof of that, that it does impact like men as well. So just to know that you're not alone, and you're in fact in really great company. So some of the famous people who've mentioned that they suffer from imposter syndrome. So Maya Angelou, she's an award-winning poet, author, highly successful in her field. She has said, I've written 11 books, but each time I think, uh-oh, they're going to find out now. I've run a game on everybody. They're going to find me out. Margaret Chan, who was the former chief of the World Health Organization, she said, there are an awful lot of people out there who think I'm an expert. How do these people believe all of this about me? I'm so much aware of all the things I don't know. And even Albert Einstein, he said, the exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me feel ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. And so these feelings are not, imposter syndrome has been named imposter syndrome pretty recently in the 1970s. But I mean, Albert Einstein was doing his work in the 40s and 50s. And so even before we had this term for it, people felt this way. And I actually quite like the word involuntary swindler, and I wish they had called it involuntary swindling. That would have been much more humorous. But these are very successful people who suffered from these cases. I don't know if that's a hand up.
It is. I see there's a hand up by Anne Rajkumar. Anne, did you want to comment on what Hilton was saying?
Yeah, for sure. I just want to know, so if, for example, if I'm like very anxious about not being able to perform at the level that is expected of me, is that a form of imposter syndrome?
Yeah, so I think it's on the next slide. And so we're going to talk about different types of imposter syndromes and how it can manifest itself. So you may see yourself in fact in one of these, and where you have anxiety about those feelings, you could fit into one of these categories. So have a look and see if you identify with any one of these subcategories. So we have this, imposter syndrome doesn't manifest in the same way for everybody. It can feel differently for different people. So there's the perfectionist. Perfectionists rarely are satisfied with their work, and it's shadowed by constant feelings that it's not up to par. Rather than focusing on their strengths and capabilities, they focus on the mistakes or compare their work to that of others. You then have the superhero. Because these individuals battle with feelings of inadequacy, they feel compelled to push themselves beyond healthy boundaries to perform as best as possible. So, I feel inadequate, so I'm just going to push as much as possible to get these things done. The expert, these individuals have persistent feelings of not knowing enough, so they consistently aim to learn more and are never satisfied with their level of understanding, even if they are often highly skilled and underrate their own expertise. Then there's the soloist. These people tend to reject group work and prefer to work individually. Often their self-worth is stemmed from their productivity, so they often reject assistance as they see asking for help as weakness that could unmask themselves as imposters or unmask their discipline. And then the final one of the final categories is that the natural genius. These type of imposters set their internal bar impossibly high, just like perfectionists. But natural genius types don't just judge themselves based on ridiculous expectations, they also judge themselves on getting things right on the first try. When they're not able to do something quickly or fluently, their alarm sounds. So, Anne, did you see yourself in any of those?
When I looked at the first one, I thought, oh my gosh, never even realized that. I feel so bad.
You feel seen. Okay, so yeah, so I mean, there's different ways that people can feel like subpar or like you're an imposter. So yeah, I mean, interesting to see that you could see yourself in that first category. Lenine, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I'm just curious about whether it's possible to be classified in multiple boxes.
I very much think so. I think these things, there's probably heavy overlap between these categories, but yeah, I mean, I personally see myself in a couple of these categories as well. So I thought it would be useful because it's not always nice to think about or it's not always easy, I should say, not always nice, not always easy to reflect on yourself, but you know, we've said, do you identify with any of them? And from my own personal experience, I felt very connected to the expert one, right? And so if we go back, the expert one, I mean, it's so bad. I feel bad saying that I'm the expert category because I'm like, oh, it's an expert. Am I being, arrogant calling myself the expert one? But that's how ridiculous I can be. But it's this feeling of not knowing enough. And I really struggle with not knowing enough. And in research, it can be quite debilitating if you have those feelings of not knowing enough, because in fact, there's so much published and so much work out there and so much research getting published every single day that it is hard to keep up with, it's hard to keep up with where the fields are, especially in today's day and age. And I think things like, I mean, I can be quite bad at looking at LinkedIn, for instance. And so I like to look at LinkedIn, follow lots of people who work in my field. And while it's really nice to see the cutting edge of research in human behavior change, for instance, it can exacerbate these feelings of not knowing enough because you constantly like, oh, look, they're writing, look at them, look at this new interesting information, look what they're saying, look what they're doing. And so it can play into those feelings of never feeling adequately like an adequate expert in your own field. So, when I reflected on my own experience, I struggle with ever feeling like I have enough knowledge. And so I often will not want to speak in situations because I fear that I will be exposed, or I feel that someone will say to me, oh, that's been disproven here. Like there's something that says this, you haven't read the latest reading. And so that fear stops me from talking. And it's often worse when you are with people that are in your expert area. And I feel often easier when I'm in a group of people who may not be experts in human behavior change, because you feel more at ease that you are comfortable with the information you know. So it's a vicious for myself, it can be a vicious cycle because those feelings reinforce themselves, right? It's this constant cycle of reinforcement of, I wish I knew more, I'm going to go and do a EBSCO host search or a Google Scholar search on the latest information in this field, and that, oh my gosh, I really don't know enough, etc., etc., vicious cycle continuing. My perfectionism characteristics, so I mean, like Lenine was saying, with these different categories, when I look at the perfectionism one, the perfectionist in me often stops me from trying. So I will be like, if I can't do this properly, which is properly from my reference point, right? So not necessarily from that it's true, it's just from my reference point, stops me from doing it. So I'll be like, I can't do this perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. And then often you'll think someone else goes and does it, and they write maybe something that you don't think is, they get a grant or they get a paper published and you're like, oh, I was just thinking those exact things. If only I'd written the paper, if only I had gone for the grant, I could have got this. But those feelings of perfectionism just stop you. So you're like, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to be shown up to be a fool. For myself, you may not feel like it from when I'm speaking to you now, but I'm naturally an introvert. And so I don't feel comfortable in social situations. And so my social battery is very low. And so often when we think about introverts and extroverts, we think about introverts as being people who don't like people, and we think about extroverts as loving the limelight. But introverts are often people who have a lower social battery. So what that means is that introverts often can still perfectly engage in a social setting, but for less time, or you feel more you get more tired from it, or you don't want to do it and you have to retreat away from people. So that's what I mean by my social battery. So I have a low social battery. I enjoy being with people, and then I need to escape. And I have a low small talk capacity, so I'm not very good at small talk. And these feelings often reinforce my feelings of imposter syndrome. So I'm like, people, I don't want to talk too much. Because I don't want to extrovert, because I don't want to talk to a lot of people, it means people think I'm going to get found out. I need to not say too much. I need to retreat, etc. So my natural inclinations can exacerbate my feelings of imposter syndrome and feed into it. I often also feel that academia rewards extroverts. And so it is often easier for people who are naturally inclined to be more verbose, for people who are more likely to want to sell themselves. And it's a much harder thing if you have imposter syndrome feelings, like if you feel like you're going to get found out, if you are more on the introvert spectrum, those things are very hard to overcome. And the other thing, and this was funny, I had done this, I was talking over this presentation earlier yesterday, and one of the people said to me, you don't celebrate your successes. So I think often with imposter syndrome, you downplay your successes. And so you'll be like, someone will say to you, well done, you got a grant. And you go, oh, yes, but now I've got to, but it's only a small grant and now I've got to go and find the next grant. Or, well done, you got a paper published. And you go, oh, yes, but it was only in, AIDS and behavior, it wasn't in nature. And so, you sort of poo-poo your own successes. And so one of the very good ways of getting over or out of a slump of feeling like you are an imposter is to celebrate your successes in an objective way and say, this is what I've achieved. And, these are the things I've achieved. I'm not a fraud. So those are, some of my very real experiences of, the things that trigger me, or the things that trigger my feelings of imposter syndrome. And I see one of the comments saying they can relate. And so, yes, our brains are very mean to us sometimes, and we are very hard on ourselves. So, I don't know if there's anyone who wants to reflect, or we can, let me just try and get to the next slide.
Of course, I'd love to reflect.
Reflect, Lenny.
The person who commented in the chat box made a very important comment. I think we are so mean to ourselves. We say horrible things. And in a previous meeting somebody mentioned that if you think about the stuff that you say to yourself, you can't do it. You're horrible. Somebody else is better at this than you. You're a failure. Blah, blah, blah. There's a whole lot of negativity that you can be saying to yourself. Would you say those same things to a child? Would you say those same things to somebody else? So why are you saying it to yourself? Be kinder to yourself. And I love what you said about celebrating your successes. Very often we don't. You're right. We move on to, oh no, it wasn't that good. Other people have done better, and we really need to stop.
Yeah. Yeah.
With so much more to say. I look at women in particular. I look at look at myself, and very often we'd find that in my experience, we don't speak up as much as others do. Others may, and it was a very strong woman who told me once, "Your voice matters. Don't be quiet. Your voice matters, and don't let anybody else say that. Say it differently. Don't let yourself talk yourself out of not talking. Talking, you know." And that's something that's been helping me with my imposter syndrome, which is pretty strong. Just notice that it's happening, and it happens often. Call it out, and remind yourself of your successes. So that's something that I've been working on. Thought I'd share since you asked. Thank you.
No, well, I mean, I think it's also, you know, one of the strategies. So often what will happen is you join lots of sort of calls with international people, right? So we have lots of calls with funders and things like that. And what I've tried to do with myself now is to say, you know, during a meeting, you have to say one thing at least. Share an opinion, have an opinion. Because what I found, and I'm sure I've often felt this when other people have said it, and so I'm sure some of you will feel the same way, is that you will be sitting in a room and you're like, I'm not going to say it because it's stupid. Like, oh, it's probably something everyone knows, so I'm not going to say it. And then someone else says it in the room. And then you go and someone will say to them, that is an excellent point that you've just raised. And then you go, you know, shit, like, wish I had said it, you know, I wish I had said it. It would have been, and then, you know, that like a typical like childhood reinforcement of like, you know, getting rewarded for something. You're like, they would have said, well done to me. You know? It's such a silly thing. And so I found that in a lot of situations, I wasn't speaking up, and then people would say the things that I was thinking, and they would get positive feedback from it. And I wasn't getting, you know, I was just keeping quiet. And so now what I've said is like, during meetings, I try and say one thing. I'm not a person who feels like I need to talk for the sake of talking. But if I say one thing and I contribute positively to that situation, that would be good for me. And it's worked. Like, you know, and that sort of reinforces it, acts as a reinforcement for itself, because you get good feedback. In the next meeting, you're like, okay, I'll share again. I'll share again. I'll share again.
Fantastic. That's what your content now has just raised so much engagement. We have a comment in the chat box and 2 people waiting to share their voice within this this panel. So perhaps we could go with the comment, in the chat box first. So Nomaswazi is asking, what is the difference between imposter syndrome and low self-esteem? In cases where you have achieved quite a lot, but don't feel confident in sharing it with others, what would this be categorized as?
Cases where you have achieved a lot, but don't feel confident in sharing it with others. So, I mean, so low self-esteem in terms of, so psychology, self-esteem is part of your self-concept. And that was done by Carl Rogers, or theorized by Carl Rogers. There's been a lot of work on self-esteem. And so self-esteem is part of your self-concept, and self-esteem deals with how you know, how confident you feel in yourself and your feelings of self-worth, etc. So I would say that imposter syndrome, people with low self-esteem would probably be more vulnerable to experiencing imposter syndrome, because they're sort of interlinked, right? If you have low self-confidence or low self-esteem about yourself, you're likely going to feel inadequate. And so you're going to more likely to feel like, I'm potentially a fraud in these situations, so I won't speak up. So I would say that low self-esteem and imposter syndrome sort of, you know, reinforcing they work synergistically with one another. And I think where you have achieved a lot and you don't feel confident in sharing it, I think that would be a classic telltale sign of feeling like an imposter or imposter syndrome. So it's like, I don't, where does that feeling of low confidence comes from that you're not sharing it? Is it a feeling of like, I don't want to share it because I feel like it won't be worthwhile, or it may make people, like, if it's not worded well, if I don't express myself correctly, people will think I'm stupid or something like that. Those are classic, telltale signs of imposter syndrome. I also think you can feel lack of confidence in sharing because you're a shy person. So you may feel quite like, oh, I'm an expert, I know exactly what I'm talking about, and just be nervous to speak about it. So, there's also a potential just low self-confidence, but they sort of feed each other. I don't know if you want, Lenine, you said there were other people who wanted to
Oh,
chat.
right. So we had, there were two. Anne had a hand up, and Uvedna is still having a hand up. Uvedna, you'd like to voice your opinion?
Hi guys, it's been interesting hearing from both of you and what your feelings are about the whole imposter syndrome thing, but I wanted to know just your thoughts. So I'm in a situation where I'm surrounded by loads of senior researchers. I'm at RE and I'm a master's student, and so there's loads of postdocs and PhD students around me, and often you feel like if you have something to contribute, it's not really of any value because at like my level, it's not really at the level of like a postdoc or like a senior researcher. And I was just wondering, like, what are your thoughts to navigate around those kind of feelings of imposter syndrome where you don't think that you're qualified to speak on certain things?
Yeah. So I mean, Lenina, you can also reflect for yourself, but
And you're the perfect person, you're the psychologist, but I have opinions.
Well,
so,
do you want to go first?
Could I take it first?
Yeah.
Right, that happens so often. I've been a master's student. I've been scared to voice my opinion. I'm worried about looking stupid in front of everybody who knows so much more about something. But in that instance, we forget that we are in the process of learning, and people accept that we are on a journey to learn. In fact, people want you to ask questions. And remember that your voice does matter. It's okay for you to show that you want to learn, not that you don't know something, but should view it instead as, I want to learn. I guarantee you, your peers, your supervisors would appreciate you expressing that sense of growth, a growth mentality, the wanting to absorb as much as possible, rather than keeping your mouth shut and attempting to hide what you think are your inadequacies. I certainly value it with my students. I love it when they ask questions. I don't regard questions as stupid. I see it as, you want to grow and I want to help you, so that sort of environment I'd like to encourage, and I hope that you are experiencing that, Uvedna, where you are. Hilton, would you like to?
So I think often, and one of the slides later is also that it's how do we create environments as, future, as senior researchers ourselves or future senior researchers in the group, if you're working towards your master's or PhDs, etc. Is it also, how do we break the cycle of sort of toxic environments, right? Where you don't feel, because often you can be in a situation, like I know Lenine personally, and I know she's a great mentor and she's really good at valuing people's input, but that isn't realistically always the case. Often we have these feelings of imposter syndrome can be reinforced by structural elements like our environment or who we are mentored by. So I think we have to be more strategic about who we choose as our mentors and who we choose as the people that we are going to work with, because we want to work in healthy environments. But it's also when you become that expert, or when you become the senior researcher, is to say, how do I make sure that I don't create an environment in which I am reinforcing feelings of imposter syndrome in the people that I'm meant to mentor? So, you know, that feeling of like, you know, being too scared to talk out. If someone says, oh, that was stupid, why did you say that? Those are, you're never going to talk again. So how do we make sure that we are better and change the environment we work in? But I mean, if you have a nice environment, I think then it is a case of like, you know, maybe doing some sort of exercise where it is a case of like, if I think something and I think it has value, if I perceive it as value, then I'm going to say it and put it out there into the world, because I can tell you now, and it's like later on the slides, there's one point that says, you know, there's no such thing as a stupid question, or like ask the stupid questions, you know, what you perceive as the stupid question. Because I can tell you now, and it's true, that in that group, there's other people who are thinking the same thing and asking the same question, and they're too scared to ask the question as well. So, you know, just put your opinion out there. If we don't own our spaces and we don't claim our spaces, you know, no one's going to ask us. We're not, you know, like our opinion will eventually just not be asked.
I love that. Could I add to that?
Yeah.
I guess another way of addressing it is to try and understand where this is coming from, and if there is any sort of a validity to your self-talk of I'm stupid, you know, so that you can deal with that and manage it. If it comes from you just not feeling comfortable speaking about what you know in that forum, maybe practice speaking your science field amongst your friends, or somewhere where it is a little bit of, where you feel a little bit more comfortable. And that would mean that you get used to it, you build your confidence speaking about this amongst friends, and then moving into a different environment where you might feel a little bit more uncomfortable, but you do still have this practice and confidence now of being able to hold your own, having a discussion of science within another forum. Your voice matters. Do not forget that. That's my little mantra, and I want to share it with everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's you know, it's very useful. And you know, personally, like I've said before, I'm not a person who is I was never a natural public speaker. I forced myself to do it at school because I knew I would have to speak. And so, you know, I was like, I'm going to do debating, I'm going to do public speaking, because I have to push myself up the comfort zones. But even those skills that I developed didn't necessarily translate, because now I feel comes with like a level of expertise that you're expected to know. But I've also found that, as I've said to, you know, because I've consciously had to make the decision to say, I'm going to speak up, I'm going to say something, like most of the time, the response is positive. It's like, okay, yes, oh, that's an excellent point. Thank you for raising that. Some people, it's also don't always expect the positive, like we don't always have to expect someone to agree with us, right? So we don't have to say something and get necessarily a positive affirmation. We can say something and someone can be like, I don't agree with you because of this. And then you can learn to respond by saying, thank you, you know, that's a good point. I didn't think about that, and add that to your knowledge system. So, you know, it's opportunities to learn, you know, from these interactions, but not to, you know, not to be too scared to say anything because you fear.
Can I add to that? Yeah. I love that concept is the concept of what you consider as failure. And I was thinking about my own experience with grant writing. You know, if you're in a research environment, you're going to have to write grants or write papers, and very often you're going to get a big old no. You'll sit for a day and be like, oh, I'm horrible, I don't deserve this. Let me just mute this person. There we go. I'm not good enough, and it's a horrible experience. But then you realize that there is an opportunity in those comments to grow, to move on, to change, to, I guess, in some cases, to improve. And it can be a useful experience as well, dealing with what you consider as failure. After you deal with the imposter syndrome meltdown before that happens. Sorry, I didn't mean to detract.
No, well, I mean, I'll move on because we've got a couple of slides. But I mean, even in research, it's often even a case with when you're dealing with funders or you're dealing with academics from the global north as well, is those feelings of like, you know, you're like, oh, well, this person is from Harvard, this person went to, you know, Columbia, this person went to University of Washington. And those become barriers. You can even become barriers to feeling like an imposter, because you're thinking, I couldn't possibly compete with someone who went to Harvard, right? That's not on. And what I found is that we hold our own, and often when there's strengths to our knowledge that people don't always have from somewhere else, right? There's no contextual knowledge, there's no knowledge, sort of experiential learning that they've done. And so there's strength to our voices being added to the conversation. And I think those conversations become like worse when we are not contributing our voices to them. So it's not only even that imposter syndrome from within our own teams, these are things that we will feel and experience as we move up in seniority, because we're going to always deal with people who we perceive are better than us or more, you know, whatever than us. So how you hone those skills to deal with that. So let me move on. So these are just common side effects of imposter syndrome. And I mean, there's wherever you go, whatever literature you look at, there's 100 million symptoms. But like, you know, these are the main ones, is that feeling of extreme lack of self-confidence, feelings of inadequacy, this constant comparison to other people. And I've been really bad at that. We're also in academia forced to compare ourselves, because we go, you know, that person is, you know, 5 years post PhD, so they're where I'm supposed to be. And then there's this constant comparison. So it can be reinforced by our environments. You can feel feelings of anxiety, feelings of self-doubt. You distrust your own intuitions and capabilities, negative self-talk, and dwelling on the past. And so I am guilty of probably almost all of these things. I often talk myself down, and I dwell on the past. So I'll be like, oh, you remember that person? And Deneen will probably laugh because she knows I've spoken to her about this. I'll be like, this person said this to me 3 years ago, and you know, maybe it's true that, you know, maybe it's true that what they said is true. And you reinforce those sorts of negative feelings about yourself. And so it's very difficult. It's very difficult to stop yourself, but it's almost like, for me, my own coping mechanisms have been to consciously sort of have to confront those things. And it often happens at like 3 o'clock in the morning. You'll be like, oh, you know, yes, okay, this is how I'm feeling. Acknowledge, own the feeling, give the feeling a name, you know, say, I'm feeling, this made me feel, that when the person said this, it made me feel inadequate. And then you have to sort of reach in your mind for all the things that say why that wasn't the case, and sort of talk yourself out of those feelings. I think often we feel negative emotions, or we feel negative things, and we don't verbalize it, or we don't label it. And then it becomes harder to sort of deal with, because it never sort of concretizes. It never becomes something real. It stays in our minds. And so it is a very useful, I've found it a useful thing to say, this person said this about me. What could be true about this? How am I possibly contributing to this perception? What is false about it? And then I'll go, this is in fact false. So you're worrying about these things, you're having these feelings, and they're not true and they're not valid. So all it's doing is sort of blocking you from moving forward. And so you have to move through it. So this is, you know, I have very profound 3 o'clock in the morning feelings. So this is what I was sort of mentioning earlier, is that we have to be aware that we don't end up doing this to others. And there's two interesting concepts in psychology. And these are often unconscious biases that we have to catch ourselves with. There's the fundamental attribution bias and the confirmation bias. And so fundamental attribution bias is what they refer to as often when something goes wrong or something bad happens, we as individuals tend to say that when someone does something wrong, it's because of a personality trait or because it's their character. So if we're mentoring others, for instance, we'll say, the student didn't meet the timeline because they're lazy or because they're incompetent or because they're just trying to shirk off the duties. Rather than, and then when we do something bad, we sort of tend to attribute it to situational factors. So we'll be like, we missed a deadline because we're busy, because we had so many meetings that day, because we had to get this article in, we had a competing interest. And so that's just, this fundamental attribution bias has been sort of found extensively through many different contexts and many different settings and many different people throughout across the globe. But so it's hard not to do anything about it. We just have to catch ourselves and maybe stop yourself and think, am I contributing to potential feelings of imposter syndrome in my students by thinking these negative things about them and attributing it perhaps falsely to their character? So that's one thing we can think about. Confirmation bias is that we tend to seek information that confirms what we believe. So what we will do is we will say, a student, or even for yourself, right? If you're reflecting on an imposter syndrome sort of scenario, what we'll do is we'll say we're inadequate. And then we tend to seek out or become highly attuned to information that confirms that we're inadequate, right? So then it'll be like, I didn't answer that email. I still have that student who, asked me to give them feedback and I haven't done this. I haven't done this. I haven't done this. See, I am a bad so I'm a bad academic, I'm a bad this person. So we have to catch ourselves from doing those things because often those are not true. And often we are then humans tend to pay a lot, we're most focused on what we pay attention to. And so with fundamental attribution bias and confirmation bias, we are often become highly attuned to those things and sort of block out things that, counter that. So be careful about that when you're engaging with students or potential people that you mentor, but also be careful and catch it in yourself. I'm not going to talk a lot about emotional intelligence, but it's just a thing of like practice self-awareness and self-regulation and empathy for others. And it's important to remember, when you're dealing with lots of different people. So one of the, I've had lots of conversations with Lenine about this, but, one of the big ways, and there's a couple of slides, I am aware of time, but like there's a couple of slides later and we can share the slides that talk about how you can deal with imposter syndrome. And, it's like knowing your why. One of them is knowing your why. And often when I read someone saying to me, you must know your why. Well, you must know your purpose. And I sort of scoff at it, right? You're like, oh, gross. Like this is like fluffy, like pseudo psychology nonsense that people sort of put on books that's, when they're trying to sell it to you. And I will honestly admit that I was one of those people who would be like, oh, this feels just like too fluffy for me, right? And until I sort of had my own feelings about knowing my purpose, and when I was confronted with knowing my own, like why I was doing it. And a lot of the insights that I have gotten to dealing with my own imposter syndrome have been through figuring out my purpose and my why as a researcher. So in terms of behavior change, purpose and goals are really critical to achieving greater things, to being more satisfied, and to sustaining the behaviors we want to sort of change, right? So if you're motivated, if you have a goal, it's easier to work on your PhD, for instance, because you're like, oh, well, the goal is to have a PhD or the goal is to contribute to the field of X, Y, Z, whatever your topic is. It's proven, that's shown through all sorts of behavior change research out there, that goals and purpose are really important parts of that journey. They're necessarily insufficient, right? It should be there, it has to be there for sustained behavior change, but it's not sufficient. And what I did is that I did my PhD 5 years ago, and I lost my why after the PhD because I spent 5 years with my why being my PhD, right? It was like, oh, what are you doing with your life? I'm doing a PhD, right? And when the PhD was done, it was like, well, okay, so now what? It felt incredibly anticlimactic to get a PhD. I don't necessarily feel like this is for what everyone's feeling, but it was sort of like, you know, you put your red gown on and it was amazing day of graduation. And the next day people are like, well, now it's back to getting papers, it's back to getting grants, right? That's your next thing. Oh, you know, well done. But, you know, that's now you've got to do something else. So it felt very anticlimactic. It just felt like another step, not this term, you know, the terminal degree of your work. And what tended to happen is I lost focus from the PhD, and I became concerned with what others thought I should do next rather than what I wanted to do for myself. And so because I was trying to work to do what other people wanted me to do rather than what I felt passionate about or what I felt would be my contribution to science, it reinforced when I reflect backwards on my feelings of feeling like an imposter, because it wasn't a field that, you know, it was a field I knew well, but that I wasn't passionate about necessarily, or it was there were things that I was forced to do, and I didn't feel like it was the things that I wanted to do or that where I could make my greatest contribution. And so I often felt inadequate. And then when you met with people, they were often like, you're not doing enough, you're not, you should be reading more, you should be writing more, you should be doing more in this thing. This is what you should be doing. And it just contributed to my feelings of never being good enough. And so I had to process that, and it's taken me 8 months of having sort of conscious time to sort of think about these things, 8 months to sort of think about what my purpose is. I felt, you know, you feel lost, you feel insecure. I had to have very honest conversations with myself, like I said to you, at 3 o'clock in the morning, and say, you know, how do I explore? Making time for exploration. Saying, what is it that I'm going to know? Because instead of becoming someone who, you know, feels like an imposter in a field because it's not my passion, I need to be someone who's relishing in the work that I do because it fulfills me, and I will want to know these things. And when I want to know these things, I will know more, and then a feeling of imposter syndrome will diminish. And that was my theory behind it. So I had to, you know, I had to re-see opportunities that I had become blind to. I had to have very honest conversations about what I'm interested in and what I want to do with my life. And I feel like that sense of purpose that I have gained over the last 8 months has helped me to overcome, or at least manage, my feelings of feeling like an imposter when I do feel like that. So I know there was a comment. So it doesn't matter. So those are my own feelings and those are my own expressions, and it will be different for everyone else. But you know, like I feel like when you're having these talks, it's best to have very honest and open conversations, because it doesn't help for people to have conversations and be like, it's all great, right? And you'll feel amazing after your PhD, when that's not always the case. And often you don't feel validated in those feelings because no one talks about those very real feelings. So what can you do? Like I said, acknowledging the presence of it is, you know, like they say, if you have an alcohol disorder, the first step is to admit you have an alcohol disorder. So it's the same as acknowledging the presence of imposter syndrome. Share your feelings with others. So find people who don't mind you, like, you know, chewing their ear off about like how you feel. It's very useful. Understand where the roots of your feelings are coming from. So, you know, for me, it often became when I had reflected enough, I could understand the roots of my feelings also coming from myself. And it forced me to say, what are my roadblocks? What am I stopping What are the roadblocks I am putting in front of myself that actually don't exist? And what are the roadblocks that exist and are true and are real? And how do I manage the real ones? And how do I work on removing the ones that are self-imposed? It also means about owning your success. I find it very difficult to take compliments. I find it very difficult. I find it uncomfortable and awkward when someone says, well done, great thing you did there. It makes me feel awkward, and I often try and explain it away. So accepting external validation is important, leveraging your resources and evaluating your environment. So like I was saying, what can be changed, what can't be changed? That's good. So I think this slide is probably a little bit more useful than the next slide, and I won't go through it, so we have a few minutes that we can have last comments if we need to. Like I said before, naming the voice and the feeling. So often if you recognize something and you give it those feelings, you validate those feelings and you talk about it, you can often start to think about ways of controlling them. You won't always, I have had many 3 o'clock conversations with myself, and I can tell you now, out of all the conversations I've had in the last 8 months, one that I had with myself about a month ago was the most useful one. Tally your successes, whether they're big or small. We don't celebrate our successes enough. Someone told me someone actually said to me, one of the impressions why my PhD felt anticlimactic was because I never celebrated it. I was just like, yeah, it's done. Move on. Utilize resources that are available to you and be transparent. So, don't pretend like those feelings don't exist. How do you acknowledge them? Feel like that, talk to other people, and create spaces where you can talk about this with others. So this is very similar, revisiting probably the most useful one is revisiting your why in order to stay motivated. Recognize that it is an important thing to establish, the purpose why you do the things you do, why, what is the difference you want to make in the world. Those are very useful conversations to have, and they can be, great and grandiose, or they can be simple. And I mean, my journey so far, just to close off, is that taking time out to pause, and how I deal with imposter syndrome myself is taking time out to pause, remember the work that you want to do, who do you want to be, and it may not be the same as the place where you are currently at, right? So it's like, am I in the right space? Do I feel like an imposter because maybe I'm not in the right space? Do I need to go somewhere else? Do I need to go to a place that's going to facilitate my goals better? As supervisors and mentors, we have to be critical of what we're doing so that we're not encouraging these feelings in the people that we are developing and whose capacity we're meant to be facilitating. Remember your strengths, so acknowledge your contributions, separate the politics of the process from the values of your contributions, reflect on your opportunities that exist, remember your values, your goals, and your identity. But it does mean that you have to deal and acknowledge and deal through feelings of having imposter syndrome, having self-esteem issues, confidence issues, and treating yourself with empathy, in fact, as well as others. And then, I did a presentation before, and I closed out with a similar statement. It's hard to be resilient, and I'm still learning. So that journey is not ended yet. And I think that was it. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you so much for sharing, Hilton. I feel seen. I'm sure there are many others on this call, especially because imposter syndrome is not uncommon. We've all experienced it to various degrees during our times in academia, in research, in work, in life. And it's something that we need to manage. So thank you so much for all the tips that you gave to recognize imposter syndrome and to, manage it, beat it down with a stick. Let me get to my goals. I'm just gonna, are there any comments or questions in these final moments we have on air with Dr. Hilton Humphreys, who's done a fantastic job of discussing imposter syndrome and putting it into such a personal perspective. Thank you for that. For me, my take-home messages here were that imposter syndrome, it can be crippling, and we would need to be able to identify that it is happening and manage it appropriately. So you get an award email coming through to your computer, you know, why are you not applying for this, Women in Science or whatever. Don't look at that thing and say, oh no, I'm not good enough. There are other people who deserve this so much more. Unpack that, acknowledge your successes, and you know, it'll be worth a shot, I'm pretty sure. Thank you very much, Hilton, for being part of this discussion, for hosting this discussion, for having and for just enlightening me and everyone else. And we hope to see you again. We'll see some thanks within the chat box. Thank you for the helpful advice. Thank you, very insightful. Thank you again. I can't even thank you enough. To everybody on the call, thank you for joining us. Our next session will be on next week on Tuesday, and we'll discuss academic bullying and harassment, another very important topic that could affect our productivity. So join us again next week for the postgraduate support group meeting. See you then. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
Bye.